The old rancher's hands trembled as he reached for the faded blanket covering something in the corner of the abandoned cabin. His weathered face had seen 40 years of hardship on the Montana plains, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. 3 words were scratched into the wooden wall above: "Please don't lift." But curiosity killed more than just cats, and what Jake Morrison discovered beneath that blanket would haunt him for the rest of his days. This is the story of a cowboy who wished he had listened to that warning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Bitter Root Valley as Jake Morrison guided his horse through the tall grass, searching for the dozen head of cattle that had wandered off during the storm 3 nights prior. At 58, Jake had been working these Montana ranges since he was barely old enough to hold reins, and he knew every creek, every ridge, and every hidden valley for miles around. But today, something felt different about the landscape he thought he knew by heart. His bay gelding, Copper, snorted nervously as they approached a grove of aspens that Jake didn't remember being quite so thick. The trees seemed to close in around them, their leaves whispering secrets in the morning breeze. Jake pulled his hat lower over his eyes and urged Copper forward. Cattle had a way of finding the most inconvenient places to hide, and he wasn't about to let a few overgrown trees keep him from bringing his herd home. It was then he saw it, a structure that shouldn't have existed, nestled between the white-barked trees like it had grown there naturally. A small log cabin, its roof sagging with age and neglect, sat in a clearing Jake would have sworn was empty just last week. The logs were weathered to a silver gray, and wild vines had claimed much of the eastern wall. Most peculiar of all, there were no roads leading to it, no cleared paths that would indicate how anyone had ever reached this hidden place. Jake dismounted and tied Copper to a sturdy aspen branch. The horse shifted restlessly, ears flicking back and forth, as if listening for something Jake couldn't hear. The silence in the grove was absolute. No birdsong, no rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, just the soft whisper of leaves overhead. The cabin door hung slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness within. Jake called out, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. "Hello? Anyone home?" The words seemed to disappear into the trees without finding their target. He approached the structure cautiously, his boots making soft, crunching sounds on the carpet of fallen leaves. The door creaked as he pushed it open wider, revealing a single room bathed in dusty shafts of sunlight that filtered through gaps in the chinked walls. The air inside was stale and carried the scent of old wood and something else, something sweet and cloying that made Jake's stomach turn slightly. Dust motes danced in the light beams, disturbed by his entrance. The cabin was sparse, furnished with only the most basic necessities. A rough-hewn table sat against one wall, its surface scarred with knife marks and stained with what looked like old coffee rings. 2 wooden chairs flanked the table, one upright, the other toppled over as if someone had left in a hurry. A cold fireplace dominated the far wall, its hearth filled with the ashes of fires long dead, but it was the corner that drew Jake's attention and held it like a magnet. There, arranged with what seemed like deliberate care, was a collection of items that told a story Jake wasn't sure he wanted to understand. A wooden crate served as a makeshift altar, its surface covered with a faded quilt. On top of the quilt sat several objects: a child's wooden toy horse, painted bright red, but now faded to a dusty pink; a small leather-bound Bible with a ribbon bookmark hanging limply from its pages; a tin cup dented on one side; and a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon that had once been vibrant but now looked grey in the dim light. Above this arrangement, someone had carved words directly into the log wall. The letters were deep and deliberate, cut with a knife blade that had been guided by either great care or great desperation. "Please don't lift the blanket," the message read, followed by what looked like a date, June 15th, 1987. Below the date, in smaller letters, were the words, "God forgive me." Jake stepped closer, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. That's when he noticed what lay beside the makeshift altar, a shape covered by a threadbare blanket that had once been blue but had faded to the color of old denim. The blanket covered something roughly the size of a large dog, or perhaps a small person. The edges of the covering were tucked neatly around whatever lay beneath, with the kind of precision that spoke of loving care rather than hasty concealment. The sweet smell was stronger here, mixed now with something earthier and more disturbing. Jake's 40 years of ranch life had acquainted him with death in all its forms. He'd seen cattle die of disease, horses break their legs, and wildlife succumb to harsh winters. But this smell was different. It carried with it a sense of tragedy that seemed to seep from the very walls of the cabin. He knelt beside the covered form, his knees creaking with the movement. The floorboards beneath groaned softly under his weight, and somewhere in the cabin's rafters, something scurried away from the disturbance. Jake reached out tentatively toward the blanket, then stopped, his hand hovering inches from the faded fabric. The warning carved into the wall seemed to echo in his mind. But curiosity was a powerful force, stronger sometimes than wisdom or caution. The toy horse on the makeshift altar caught his eye again. It was hand-carved, the work of someone with skill and patience. One of the horse's legs was chipped, and the paint was worn away in places where small fingers had gripped it tightly. Beside it, the Bible lay open to a page in Psalms, though Jake couldn't make out the specific verse from where he knelt. The letters tied with the blue ribbon appeared to be addressed to someone named "My Dearest Sarah," written in the careful script of someone who had taken time with each word. The ink had faded to brown, and the paper had the brittle look of age. These weren't recent correspondence, but relics from another time, carefully preserved, like everything else in this strange shrine. Jake's attention returned to the covered form. The blanket rose and fell in gentle curves, suggesting the shape of whatever lay beneath, without revealing its nature. There were no obvious signs of what it might be, no protruding limbs or recognizable silhouettes that would give away the mystery. Just that careful arrangement of fabric that seemed to have been, positioned with the same loving attention as everything else in this corner of the cabin. The silence in the grove outside seemed to press against the cabin walls, as if the very forest was holding its breath. Jake realized he hadn't heard Copper move or whinny since entering the cabin, which was unusual for the normally restless horse. Even the wind had stilled, leaving the aspen leaves motionless and quiet. Standing slowly, Jake walked to the single window that looked out toward where he'd left his horse. Copper stood exactly where he'd been tied, but his head was raised high, ears pricked forward, staring at the cabin with an intensity that made Jake uneasy. It was the way horses looked when they sensed predators or danger, alert, ready to flee at the first sign of threat. Jake returned to the corner, drawn by questions he couldn't answer. Who had lived in this cabin? When had they been here last? Why was it hidden so deep in the grove that he'd never noticed it before, despite riding this range for decades? And most pressing of all, what lay beneath that carefully arranged blanket that warranted such a solemn warning? The date carved into the wall, 1987, suggested the cabin had been abandoned for over 30 years. But the items in the corner didn't look that old. The quilt, while faded, wasn't moth-eaten or falling apart as it should be after 3 decades of abandonment. The letters, though yellowed, were still neatly tied and readable. Even the toy horse, despite its worn paint, showed no signs of the rot or decay that should have claimed it by now. Jake knelt again beside the blanket, close enough now to see that it wasn't just faded denim blue, but had a pattern woven into the fabric. Tiny flowers and vines that spoke of a woman's touch, of someone who had cared about beauty even in simple things. The edges were hemmed with small, precise stitches that showed the work of patient hands. The sweet smell was overwhelming now, thick and cloying in a way that made Jake's eyes water slightly. It wasn't the smell of flowers or perfume, but something organic and complex that seemed to speak of both preservation and decay. He'd encountered similar odors before, in the hidden corners of old barns where animals had died and been forgotten. But this was different. This carried with it an almost ceremonial quality, as if whatever lay beneath the blanket had been treated with reverence and care. His hand moved toward the blanket's edge again, fingers trembling slightly with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The warning on the wall seemed to burn in his peripheral vision, but human nature rarely heeds its own best interests. Jake Morrison had spent his life solving problems and answering questions, and the mystery beneath the blue blanket had become the most compelling puzzle he'd ever encountered. The cabin around him seemed to hold its breath as his fingers made contact with the soft fabric. It was surprisingly warm to the touch, as if whatever lay beneath still held some spark of life. The texture was worn smooth by age and handling, soft as a baby's skin, and just as fragile. Jake could feel the weight of the thing beneath, not heavy, but substantial enough to create gentle valleys and peaks in the blanket's surface. Outside, Copper whinnied nervously, a sound that cut through the unnatural silence like a blade. Jake paused, his hand still resting on the blanket's edge, listening to his horse's distress. In all their years together, Copper had never shown such sustained anxiety without good reason. Horses, Jake had learned long ago, sensed things that humans missed, felt dangers that remained invisible to less sensitive creatures. But the pull of the mystery was stronger than caution. Jake's fingers found the blanket's edge and began to lift it slowly, carefully, as if he were unwrapping something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. The sweet smell grew stronger, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded remarkably like his late wife's whispered that some secrets were meant to stay buried. Some blankets were meant to remain unlifted. He ignored the voice and continued his careful unveiling, knowing that whatever he found beneath would change something fundamental about his understanding of the world, about the hidden stories that lived in the forgotten corners of familiar places. The morning sun slanted lower through the cabin's single window, casting longer shadows across the makeshift shrine, and Jake Morrison prepared to discover what the person who had carved that warning into the wall had been so desperate to hide. As Jake's fingers gripped the edge of the blanket, a sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin's loose boards, causing him to freeze mid-motion. The sound broke the spell of silence that had enveloped the grove, and for a moment rational thought returned. He released the fabric and sat back on his heels, heart pounding with an intensity that surprised him. What was he doing? This wasn't his property, wasn't his mystery to solve. Someone had taken great care to arrange this shrine and had left an explicit warning. Yet even as these thoughts crossed his mind, Jake knew he wouldn't be able to leave without answers. The questions would eat at him, follow him home to his own ranch, disturb his sleep and poison his peace. He stood and walked to the overturned chair, righting it with hands that trembled slightly. The chair was heavier than expected, made of solid oak that had been sanded smooth by years of use. On its seat, he noticed deep scratches in the wood, not random marks but deliberate scores, as if someone had sat here repeatedly, nervously carving lines with a knife blade, while wrestling with impossible decisions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The bundle of letters on the makeshift altar drew his attention. The blue ribbon that bound them was silk, he realized now, expensive and carefully chosen. Someone had valued these letters enough to preserve them with materials that would last. The topmost envelope bore a return address from Billings, Montana, dated April 1987, just 2 months before the date carved into the wall. Jake picked up the bundle with reverence, feeling the weight of decades-old emotions pressed between the pages. The paper crackled softly as he untied the ribbon, revealing a stack of perhaps 20 letters, all addressed to Sarah Mitchell at a post office box in the nearby town of Clearwater. The return address belonged to Thomas Mitchell, the same surname suggesting a family connection. The first letter he opened was dated March 15, 1987. "My darling Sarah, I know you said not to write, but I can't bear the silence anymore. Little Emma asks about you every day. She made you a drawing yesterday, a picture of our family standing in front of the cabin. She drew herself holding your hand, and she colored your hair that beautiful red that I fell in love with all those years ago. I've enclosed it with this letter, though I know you probably won't write back. The doctor in billing says there might be new treatments, experimental ones. Please, Sarah, come home. We need you. Emma needs you. I need you. Jake's hands shook as he read. The letter was signed simply, "Forever yours, Tommy," and attached with a rusty paperclip was indeed a child's drawing, stick figures rendered in crayon on construction paper. A man, a woman, and a small child stood beneath a house with a smoking chimney. The woman's hair was colored bright red, and she was smiling a wide, crooked smile that only a child's hand could create. The second letter, dated March 28th, was shorter. "Sarah, please answer my letters. Emma is asking harder questions now. She wants to know why Mama went away, why she can't visit you. I don't know what to tell her anymore. The cabin feels so empty without you. I've kept your garden growing, though I'm not nearly as good with flowers as you were. The roses by the front steps are blooming early this year. They seem to be looking for you, too." Jake's eyes moved to the tin cup on the altar. Up close, he could see that it wasn't just dented, but decorated. Tiny flowers had been painted around its rim in delicate brush strokes. A woman's touch, careful and artistic. Sarah's touch. The third letter was different in tone, dated April 10th. "My beloved Sarah, I visited Dr. Henderson again today. He explained everything to me, about what's happening to your mind, about how the sickness is stealing you away piece by piece. He said there might come a time when you won't remember us at all, when the woman I married disappears completely. I can't accept that. I won't accept that. I've been researching, reading everything I can find. There are places, facilities that specialize in cases like yours. They're expensive, but I'll mortgage the ranch if I have to. Please, just give me a chance to fight for you." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cabin's cool interior. The pieces of the puzzle were forming a picture he didn't want to see, but couldn't look away from. The letters continued, each one revealing more of a tragedy that had unfolded 35 years ago in this very place. April 20th. "Sarah, you disappeared again last night. I found you in the morning, sitting by the creek in your nightgown, talking to people who weren't there. You called me Daddy and asked when Mama was coming home. Emma saw it happen. She's too young to understand, but old enough to be frightened. I can't keep putting her through this. I can't keep hoping that the woman I married will come back to us." April 25. "I've made the arrangements. There's a place in Denver, a hospital, that has doctors who understand your condition. They have treatments, medications that might slow the progression. The truck is packed, and Emma is staying with my sister until we get you settled. I know you'll fight me on this, but it's the only way. I love you too much to watch you disappear completely." The final letter was different from the others, written on different paper in a shakier hand. It was dated June 10, 1987. "My dearest Sarah, you're gone. Not dead, but gone in every way that matters. The doctors say your condition progressed faster than they expected. Yesterday you looked at me like I was a stranger, like the 20 years we shared together never happened. You asked for your mother, who's been dead for 15 years. You don't remember Emma exists. I brought you home. Sarah, I couldn't leave you in that sterile place, surrounded by people who don't know that you used to sing while you cooked breakfast, that you collected pressed flowers in old books, that you cried during every movie we ever watched together, even the comedies. I brought you home to the cabin where we were married, where Emma was conceived, where we planned to grow old together. You seem calmer here, even if you don't remember why. Sometimes, just for a moment, I see a flicker of recognition in your eyes. It's enough. It has to be enough. I don't know what's going to happen next. I can't care for you alone, and I can't put Emma through watching her mother fade away day by day. But I can't send you back to that place either. God help me, I don't know what to do." The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting matched the previous correspondence. Jake's vision blurred as he folded the paper back along its creases. He looked again at the child's drawing, at the happy family that would never exist in reality. At least not in the way the little girl had imagined. The wooden toy horse suddenly made sense. Emma's toy, left here as a reminder or perhaps as company for a mother who no longer remembered she had a daughter. The Bible, bookmarked to Psalms, probably marked a passage about finding strength in impossible circumstances. And the tin cup with its painted flowers, Sarah's cup, decorated by her own hand in healthier times. Jake's gaze returned to the covered form in the corner. The terrible sweetness in the air, the careful arrangement of the blanket, the warning carved into the wall, it all pointed to a conclusion he didn't want to reach. But the evidence was overwhelming, painted in the desperate words of a man who had faced an impossible choice. He walked to the single window and looked out at Copper, who was still standing alert, ears forward, as if sensing the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded in this place. The horse's obvious distress now made perfect sense. Animals were sensitive to death, to the lingering echoes of human suffering. When Jake turned back to the shrine, something caught his eye that he hadn't noticed before. Partially hidden behind the Bible was a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn smooth by handling, and a pencil was tucked into the binding. With trembling hands, he opened it to the first entry, June 11th, 1987. I've done something terrible. God forgive me, I've done something that will damn my soul to hell, but I couldn't watch her suffer anymore. She didn't even know who I was at the end. She was frightened, confused, calling out for people who've been dead for years. The doctors said it would only get worse, that she would lose the ability to speak, to recognize faces, to feed herself. They said she might linger for years in that condition. I couldn't do it. I couldn't watch the woman I loved disappear piece by piece until nothing was left but an empty shell. So I brought her here, to our cabin, to the place where we were happiest. I made her comfortable, gave her the tea with the herbs I researched, the ones that would let her sleep peacefully. She went quietly, holding my hand, looking at me with eyes that finally seemed to recognize me one last time. What have I done? What kind of monster am I? But how could I let her live in that twilight world between life and death? How could I abandon her to strangers who would never know her laugh, her dreams, her gentle heart? The entries continued, each one revealing more of Thomas Mitchell's torment. June 12th. I can't bury her. I know I should, but I can't put her in the cold ground, not yet. I've wrapped her in the blanket she made for our wedding bed, surrounded her with the things she loved. Emma's toy horse, the Bible she read every Sunday, the cup I gave her for our first anniversary. She looks peaceful. For the first time in months, she looks at peace. Emma is asking questions. My sister says she keeps asking when Mama is coming home. I don't know what to tell her. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that sometimes love means making impossible choices? That sometimes mercy looks like betrayal? June 13th, I've made my decision. I can't live with what I've done, but I can't undo it either. Emma will be better off without me, without the shadow of this guilt hanging over her life. My sister will raise her, give her the love and stability she deserves. But I can't leave Sarah alone. I won't abandon her twice. I've carved a warning into the wall. Someday someone might find this place. They shouldn't have to see what I've done, shouldn't have to carry the weight of this secret. Some things are meant to stay hidden, some blankets are meant to remain undisturbed. The final entry was dated June 15th, 1987. It's time. I've written letters to my sister, to the sheriff, explaining everything. Emma will be provided for. The ranch is in a trust for her, and there's enough money to see her through college. I've asked that she never be told the truth about what happened here. Let her remember her parents as they were in happier times. I'm going to lie down beside my Sarah now, in the place where we were married, where we dreamed of forever. The same herbs that gave her peace will give me peace too. Maybe God will forgive us both, or maybe we're damned for what we've done. But we'll be damned together, and that has to be enough. To whoever finds this journal, I'm sorry you had to discover our secret. Please honor the warning I've carved above. Some love stories don't have happy endings, and some truths are too heavy for living hearts to bear. Jake's hands shook as he closed the journal. The picture was complete now, painted in desperate words and careful arrangements. Thomas Mitchell had been faced with an impossible choice: watch his beloved wife disappear into the cruel twilight of dementia, or grant her a merciful end to her suffering. And when he made his choice, he couldn't live with the weight of it. The covered form in the corner wasn't one body, but two. Sarah and Thomas Mitchell, husband and wife, lying together in their final sleep. The sweet smell wasn't decay, but preservation. The careful work of a man who couldn't bear to let go, who had used his knowledge of herbs and his deep love to create a shrine that had lasted decades. Jake looked at the child's drawing again, at little Emma's vision of a happy family. She would be in her 40s now, probably with children of her own. Did she ever wonder what really happened to her parents? Did she remember this cabin, or had the trauma of their disappearance been too much for a 6-year-old mind to process? Outside, the sun had moved across the sky, casting different shadows through the single window. Copper was still waiting patiently, though his ears remained pricked forward, his body tense with awareness of something his human companion was only beginning to understand. Jake knew he stood at a crossroads. He could lift the blanket, confirm what he already knew lay beneath, and carry that image with him for the rest of his days. Or he could honor the warning, respect the wishes of a man who had faced an impossible choice and paid the ultimate price for love. The rational part of his mind said he should contact the authorities, report the discovery, let professionals handle the situation. But the letters, the journal, the careful preservation of this shrine, it all spoke of a love so deep and desperate that it transcended normal rules and expectations. As Jake wrestled with his decision, he noticed something else on the altar that he had missed before. Tucked behind the bundle of letters was a small envelope, unmarked and sealed. Unlike the other correspondence, this one appeared to have been placed there recently. The paper was clean, unaged, and the envelope bore no postmark or address. With trembling fingers, Jake opened the envelope and found a single sheet of paper covered in feminine handwriting. The letter was dated just 3 days ago. Jake's blood ran cold as he read the fresh letter, written in elegant cursive script that belonged to someone who had learned penmanship in a different era. To whoever finds this place, I know you're reading my father's words, trying to understand what happened here 35 years ago. My name is Emma Mitchell Carson, and I was 6 years old when my parents disappeared from my life forever. I've spent decades searching for answers, following every lead, chasing every whisper of where they might have gone. 3 days ago, I finally found this cabin. I know what lies beneath that blanket. I've known since I was old enough to piece together the fragments of my childhood memories. My father thought he was protecting me by sending me away, but children see more than adults realize. I remember the way my mother's eyes became vacant, the way she stopped recognizing me, the desperate phone calls my father made to doctors in the middle of the night. I also remember the herbs he grew in the garden behind our house, the medical books he pored over, the careful notes he made about dosages and effects. My father was a gentleman, but when faced with watching the woman he loved disappear into madness, he made the only choice his heart would allow. I don't condemn him for what he did. How could I? I've watched my own husband struggle with the same disease that took my mother. I've seen the vacant stare that replaced recognition, felt the heartbreak of being forgotten by someone who once knew me better than I knew myself. I understand now what my father couldn't bear to endure, but I can't leave them here anymore. 35 years is long enough for them to rest in this hidden shrine. It's time for them to have a proper burial, time for their story to find some form of peace. By the time you read this, I'll have already made the necessary arrangements. The authorities know what they'll find here, and they understand the circumstances that led to this tragedy. If you're reading this, you're probably the rancher who's been searching for lost cattle. I saw your horse tracks in the clearing. Please don't think less of my father for what he did. He was a good man faced with an impossible situation, and he chose love over law, mercy over convention. In the end, isn't that what any of us would hope to do? I've left this letter because I wanted someone to know the truth, to understand that what happened here wasn't murder but mercy. My parents loved each other enough to face eternity together, and while I mourned their loss my entire life, I've come to understand that some love stories have their own logic, their own inevitable conclusions. Thank you for respecting their privacy for as long as you did. When you leave this place, please remember them as they were, two people who loved so deeply that even death couldn't separate them. Emma Mitchell Carson, June 18th, 2024. Jake read the letter twice, his mind struggling to process its implications. Emma had been here just 3 days ago. She had stood in this very spot, looked upon the shrine her father had created, and finally understood the truth that had shaped her entire life. But more disturbing was her mention of authorities, of arrangements already made. If she had contacted law enforcement, why hadn't they arrived yet? He folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the altar. The mystery had taken on new dimensions, layers of complexity he hadn't anticipated. Emma's visit explained the letter's fresh appearance, but it raised new questions about timing, about why she had waited 35 years to return to this place. Jake walked to the window again, checking on Copper, but his horse's behavior had changed. The gelding was no longer standing alert, with ears pricked forward. Instead, he was grazing peacefully, his head down, his posture relaxed. It was as if whatever presence had been keeping him on edge had suddenly lifted, leaving only the normal sounds of a forest afternoon. Returning to the shrine, Jake noticed other details he had missed before. The dust patterns on the floor showed recent disturbance, footprints other than his own, smaller and more delicate. Emma's prints confirming her recent visit. But there were other signs too. A water bottle tucked discreetly behind the overturned chair, modern and out of place among the decades-old artifacts. A small bouquet of fresh wildflowers laid beside the blanket, their petals still bright and their stems still moist. Emma hadn't just come to see her parents' resting place, she had come to say goodbye. Jake knelt beside the blanket one more time. His perspective now completely changed. This wasn't just a mystery to be solved, but a family's final chapter, a story of love and loss that had played out across decades. The warning carved into the wall took on new meaning now. Thomas Mitchell hadn't just been protecting strangers from a disturbing discovery. He had been protecting his daughter from a truth too. Heavy for a child to bear, the sweet smell that permeated the cabin made sense now too. Thomas had been a rancher, a man who understood preservation, who knew about herbs and natural processes. He had used his knowledge to create something unprecedented, a shrine that could last decades, a place where love could transcend time and death. As Jake contemplated the tragedy before him, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze, the distant hum of vehicle engines approaching through the forest. Multiple vehicles, moving slowly and deliberately through terrain not meant for automobiles. Emma's arrangements were being carried out. Her promise to give her parents a proper burial was about to be fulfilled. Jake realized he had perhaps minutes before officials arrived, minutes to decide how he wanted to be found at this scene. He could leave immediately, slip away through the trees, and let Emma's story play out without his involvement. Or he could stay, become part of the official record, help ensure that the truth Emma wanted told would be preserved. The decision was made for him when he heard his name being called from outside the cabin. "Jake Morrison, this is Sheriff Patricia Connolly. We know you're in there, and we'd like to talk with you." Jake stood slowly, his joints protesting after the emotional strain of the past hour. He walked to the cabin door and opened it fully, stepping into the afternoon sunlight. 3 vehicles had somehow navigated the grove: a sheriff's department SUV, a county coroner's van, and a civilian pickup truck, that looked like it belonged to a rancher. Sheriff Connolly was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much of human tragedy. She approached the cabin with the careful steps of someone who understood the gravity of what lay inside. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Patricia Connolly, Clearwater County Sheriff. We received a call from Emma Mitchell Carson 3 days ago about this location. She said we might find someone here today, someone searching for lost cattle who might stumble upon her family's situation." Jake nodded, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. "She left a letter inside. Explains everything that happened here." "We know," the sheriff said gently. "Emma provided us with copies of all her father's correspondence, his journal entries, even the original police reports from when they disappeared. We've been investigating this case for 35 years, Jake. It's time to bring it to a close." Behind the sheriff, Jake could see other figures moving with professional efficiency. The coroner, a tall man with gentle hands, was preparing equipment with reverence due to a sacred site. 2 deputies stood at respectful distances, their heads bowed as if they were in a church rather than at a crime scene. "Is Emma here?" Jake asked. Sheriff Connolly shook her head. "She couldn't bear to be present for this part. She said her goodbyes 3 days ago and asked us to handle the rest. She's driving back to Denver today, where she lives with her family. But she wanted to make sure someone understood what really happened here, why her father made the choices he did." The sheriff paused, studying Jake's face. "Emma said you'd probably find this place eventually, that the cattle trails all lead through this grove. She hoped that if someone discovered her parents before we could arrange this recovery, it would be someone who understood the land, who would respect what they found." Jake looked back at the cabin, at the shrine that had held its secrets for 35 years. "What happens now?" "Now we do what Emma requested. We give Thomas and Sarah Mitchell a proper burial together in the Clearwater Cemetery. There's a plot waiting for them, purchased by Emma years ago when she first suspected what she might find. The headstone is already carved. It lists them as beloved husband, wife, and parents, reunited in eternal love." The coroner approached respectfully. "Mr. Morrison, Emma mentioned that whoever found this place would probably want to understand what they had discovered. If you'd like to stay while we work, you're welcome. But I want you to know what we find under that blanket. It's going to confirm what you've already figured out from reading the letters and journal." Jake considered the offer. Part of him wanted to see this through, to witness the final chapter of the Mitchell family story. But another part, the part that had been moved by Emma's letter and Thomas's desperate love, felt that some moments were too private for strangers to witness. "I think I'll wait outside," he said finally. "This is their family's moment, not mine." Sheriff Connolly nodded with approval. "That's probably the right choice. Emma will be glad to hear that the person who found her parents understood the sacred nature of what her father created here." As the officials entered the cabin to begin their careful work, Jake walked back to where Copper was grazing. The horse looked up at his approach, and Jake could swear he saw something like relief in the animal's dark eyes. Whatever presence had disturbed Copper earlier had clearly lifted, as if Thomas and Sarah Mitchell had been waiting 35 years for their daughter to find them, to understand their story, to give them permission to finally rest. Jake untied his horse and prepared to leave. But Sheriff Connolly called out to him one more time. "Mr. Morrison, Emma left something else for you. She said she hoped the person who found this place would be someone who could appreciate what her father was trying to preserve." The sheriff handed him a small wooden box, intricately carved with the same skill that had created Emma's toy horse. Inside, nestled in soft fabric, was a photograph. It showed a young family. A handsome man with kind eyes, a beautiful woman with striking red hair, and a little girl with pigtails who was grinning at the camera. They were standing in front of the very cabin where Jake had made his discovery, but in the photograph it looked different. The logs were new and golden, flowers bloomed in window boxes, and smoke rose cheerfully from the chimney. On the back of the photograph, in the same elegant script Jake had seen in Emma's letter, were the words, "The Mitchell family, Summer 1986. This is how I want them remembered. Below that, in different handwriting, a child's careful printing, were the words, Mama, Daddy and me. Happy forever. Jake closed the box carefully, understanding the gift Emma had given him. She had shared not just the tragedy of her family's end, but the joy of their beginning. The love that had made Thomas's impossible choice both heartbreaking and inevitable. As he mounted Copper and prepared to ride away from the grove, Jake could hear the quiet voices of the officials inside the cabin, speaking in hushed tones as they began their careful work. The mystery that had consumed his morning was resolved, but the impact would remain with him forever. He had come searching for lost cattle and instead found a story about love that transcended death, about a man who chose mercy over law, about a daughter who spent 35 years searching for truth and found the courage to honor her parents' memory despite the pain it brought. The sun was beginning to set as Jake rode away from the aspen grove, the wooden box secure in his saddlebag. Behind him, the Mitchell family's long separation was finally coming to an end. Ahead of him, the familiar ranges of his own ranch waited, but they would never look quite the same. He had learned that even the most familiar landscapes could hide stories of profound love and loss, that some secrets were preserved not to deceive, but to protect, and that sometimes the greatest act of love was knowing when to let go. Copper broke into a gentle lope as they emerged from the grove, eager to return to familiar ground. But Jake found himself looking back one more time at the trees that had sheltered the Mitchell family's shrine for 35 years. He offered a silent prayer for their peace and a promise that he would remember them not as a tragedy discovered but as a love story that had finally found its proper ending. The last thing he heard as they crested the ridge was Sheriff Connolly's voice, speaking quietly to her team. Easy now. These folks have waited long enough to go home. 3 weeks had passed since Jake's discovery in the aspen grove, but the wooden box containing the Mitchell family photograph remained on his kitchen table, unopened since that first evening when he'd shown it to his wife, Margaret. She had listened to his account with tears in her eyes, understanding immediately why the story had affected him so deeply. They had been married 32 years themselves, and the thought of facing what Thomas Mitchell had endured sent chills through both of them. The local newspaper had run a respectful article about the resolution of a 35-year-old missing persons case, but the reporter had kept the details vague at Emma's request. The official story mentioned only that Thomas and Sarah Mitchell had been found deceased in a remote cabin and that their daughter had been notified. There was no mention of the circumstances, no speculation about what had driven a loving husband to make such a desperate choice. Jake had given his statement to Sheriff Connolly, describing how he'd discovered the cabin while searching for cattle. He mentioned finding the letters and journal, but emphasized that Emma's own investigation had led to the resolution. The sheriff had been grateful for his discretion, understanding that some stories required careful handling to protect the innocent. This morning, however, Jake's routine was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. He was checking on his pregnant mares in the south pasture when he spotted a rental car navigating the dusty road to his ranch house. The vehicle moved slowly, unfamiliar with the ruts and rocks that Jake's truck handled automatically. Margaret met him at the gate as he rode back to the house. "There's a woman here to see you," she said quietly. "Says her name is Emma Carson. She's been waiting about 10 minutes, very polite. I offered her coffee, but she seems nervous." Jake's heart skipped. Emma Mitchell Carson had driven from Denver to see him. He dismounted and handed Copper's reins to Margaret. "Would you mind taking care of him? I think this might be an important conversation." Emma was sitting on the front porch steps when Jake approached, and he was struck by how much she resembled the little girl in the family photograph. Her hair was no longer the bright red of childhood, but had mellowed to auburn with threads of silver, and her face bore the lines of a woman who had lived through significant challenges. But her eyes held the same bright intelligence he had seen in that long-ago snapshot. "Mr. Morrison," she said, standing as he approached. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Mrs. Carson. Please call me Jake. Would you like to come inside? My wife makes excellent coffee." Emma smiled, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her since she arrived. "Actually, would you mind if we talked out here? I've spent so many years in offices and conference rooms discussing my parents' disappearance. It feels good to be somewhere open, honest." They settled into the wooden chairs on Jake's porch, chairs he'd built himself from timber cut on his own land. Emma gazed out over the rolling pastures where Jake's cattle grazed peacefully, a scene that could have come from any decade of the past century. "Sheriff Connolly told me how you handled finding my parents," Emma began. "She said you could have sensationalized it, could have called the media or made it into something ugly, but you chose to respect their privacy, to let their story be told with dignity." "I wanted to thank you for that," Jake shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't do anything special, ma'am. Just seemed like the right way to handle things. You'd be surprised how many people wouldn't have seen it that way." Emma's voice carried the weight of long experience with human nature. "I've spent 35 years dealing with investigators, reporters, and curiosity seekers who wanted to turn my family's tragedy into entertainment. Finding someone who understood the sacred nature of what my father created. It means more than you know." She reached into her purse and withdrew a manila envelope. "I brought you something. Sheriff Connolly mentioned that you seemed moved by the family photograph I left for you. I thought you might appreciate knowing the whole story, not just the tragic ending." The envelope contained perhaps 50 photographs, spanning what looked like 20 years of the Mitchell family's life. Jake examined them carefully, seeing the progression from Thomas and Sarah's wedding photos through Emma's birth and early childhood. The pictures told a story of profound happiness. Vacations to Yellowstone, Christmas mornings around a tree heavy with handmade ornaments, birthday parties in the backyard of a modest ranch house. "This is them building the cabin where you found them," Emma said, pointing to a series of photos showing Thomas and Sarah working side by side, raising log walls and fitting roof beams. It was going to be their retreat, a place where they could escape when ranch life got overwhelming. They spent 2 summers working on it, every weekend when the weather was good. Jake studied the images of the cabin under construction. It looked completely different from the forgotten shrine he had discovered, bright and hopeful, a symbol of dreams rather than desperation. Sarah was laughing in one photo, her red hair caught by sunlight as she steadied a wall beam for Thomas to nail in place. "She was diagnosed when I was 5, Emma continued. "Early onset Alzheimer's, though they didn't call it that then. The doctors said it was extremely rare in someone so young, but that made it even more aggressive. She went from being my vibrant, loving mother to someone else in less than 2 years. Emma's voice remained steady, but Jake could see her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. This was clearly still difficult territory, even after decades of processing. I remember the day my father realized I was frightened of her. Sarah had been trying to cook breakfast, but couldn't remember how to operate the stove. She became frustrated, then angry, then started crying because she couldn't understand what was wrong with her. I hid in my bedroom until my father came to find me. She pulled out another photograph, this one showing Thomas kneeling beside a young Emma, both of them looking serious. He took this picture to remember the conversation where he promised me that no matter what happened to Mama, he would always protect me. He said that sometimes people get sick in ways that can't be fixed, but that didn't mean we loved them any less. Jake found himself studying Thomas's face in the photograph. The man looked exhausted, aged beyond his years, but his arm around his daughter was protective and sure. This was a father who would do anything to shield his child from pain, even if it meant carrying unbearable burdens himself. The last clear memory I have of my mother is from about 6 months before they disappeared, Emma said, her voice growing softer. She was having one of her good days, and she called me into her bedroom. She made me promise that no matter what happened, I would remember that she loved me. She said there might come a time when she couldn't tell me that herself, but it would always be true. Emma wiped her eyes with a tissue she pulled from her pocket. I didn't understand what she was trying to tell me. I do now. The next series of photographs showed the family's gradual disintegration. Sarah appeared increasingly confused and distant in later pictures, while Thomas looked more strained with each passing month. Emma, still very young, seemed to shrink in the images, as if she was trying to make herself small enough to avoid the chaos surrounding her. My father's sister took these last ones, Emma explained, indicating photos from what appeared to be a Christmas celebration. You can see that Mama didn't really understand what was happening. She kept asking who all these people were, why they were in her house. But look at my father's face. Jake examined the photograph Emma indicated. Thomas was watching Sarah with an expression of such profound sadness that it was painful to witness. This was a man watching the woman he loved disappear piece by piece, knowing there was nothing he could do to stop it. Aunt Helen told me years later that my father had been researching end-of-life options for months before they disappeared. Not just medical facilities, but other possibilities. He'd been reading about death with dignity movements, about people who chose their own endings rather than lingering in conditions they found unbearable. Emma's revelation hung in the air between them. Jake realized she was sharing information she had probably never discussed with anyone else. Truths too difficult for official reports or casual conversations. I don't think he planned it, she continued. I think he brought Mama to the cabin, hoping that familiar surroundings might help her remember, might bring her back to him somehow. But when she didn't, when she continued to decline, even in the place where they'd been happiest, I think he made a spontaneous decision based on love rather than logic. She pulled out the final photograph, one Jake hadn't seen before. It showed Thomas and Sarah sitting together on the porch of the completed cabin, both of them smiling at the camera. Sarah's eyes were clear and bright, and Thomas looked younger, unburdened by the weight that would soon crush him. This was taken the summer before her diagnosis, Emma said. They were talking about retiring early, spending more time at the cabin, maybe traveling to see the places they'd dreamed about. They had such plans, Jake, such beautiful, ordinary plans. Jake felt the weight of understanding settle over him. The tragedy wasn't just in what Thomas had done, but in what had been lost. Decades of love that should have continued. Grandchildren who should have known their grandparents. A simple happiness that had been stolen by disease and circumstance. Why are you telling me this? He asked gently. I mean, I'm honored that you'd share it, but why me? Emma smiled sadly. Because you saw their shrine and understood what it meant. Because you read my father's words and didn't judge him. Because when you had the chance to sensationalize their story, you chose to protect it instead. She paused, gathering her thoughts. And because I think you understand something about love that lasts beyond death. She was right, though Jake hadn't realized it until she said it. His own marriage to Margaret had deepened over 32 years into something that transcended romance or passion. It had become a fundamental part of who he was, as essential as breathing. The thought of watching Margaret disappear into illness while being powerless to help her was almost unbearable. There's something else, Emma said, reaching back into her purse. Something I haven't told anyone else, not even Sheriff Connolly. She withdrew a small, leather-bound book, another journal, but newer than the one Jake had found in the cabin. I kept a diary when I was 6 years old. My teacher had encouraged all the students to write down their thoughts and feelings. I only recently found it when I was going through old boxes in my aunt's attic. Emma opened the journal to a page marked with a ribbon. This entry is from June 16, 1987, the day after my father's final journal entry. The day after, she handed the book to Jake, pointing to a child's careful handwriting. Daddy came to say goodbye last night. I was supposed to be asleep, but I heard his truck in the driveway. He came into my room and hugged me for a long time. He smelled like the cabin, like pine trees and flowers. He told me that he and Mama were going on a trip and that Aunt Helen would take care of me now. He said they would always love me, even if I couldn't see them anymore. I asked him if Mama was getting better, and he said she was going to be peaceful now. He said sometimes, when people are very sick, the kindest thing is to help them not hurt anymore. I didn't understand, but he seemed sad, so I told him I loved him too. This morning Aunt Helen was crying, and she said Mum and Daddy went to heaven together. I don't think that's exactly what happened, but I don't want to make Aunt Helen more sad, so I didn't tell her about Daddy's visit. Jake read the entry twice, his heart breaking for the little girl who had been wise enough to understand that her father was saying goodbye forever. Emma, it means he didn't just make an impulsive decision, she finished. It means he drove back to town that night after he'd given Mama her final piece, and he came to see me one last time. It means he chose to die not in despair but in love. After making sure I knew I was cherished, the revelation changed everything about the story Jake thought he knew. Thomas Mitchell hadn't been a man driven to desperate action by grief and exhaustion. He had been a father who made careful, deliberate choices based on love for both his wife and his daughter. He had ensured Sarah's suffering ended with dignity, and then he had made sure Emma knew she was loved before he chose to join his wife in whatever came next. I've never told anyone about that visit, because I was afraid it would change how people saw what he did, Emma said. I was afraid they would think it was a premeditated murder rather than an act of mercy. But I think you understand the difference, Jake nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The courage it must have taken for Thomas to drive back to town that night, to face his daughter knowing it was the last time, to choose death not from despair but from love. It was almost incomprehensible. What will you do now? He asked finally. Emma smiled, and for the first time since her arrival, she looked peaceful. I'm going to live, Jake. I spent 35 years trying to solve the mystery of my parents' disappearance, and now that I know the truth, I can finally let them rest. I have grandchildren now who deserve to know their grandmother is at peace with the past. She stood to leave, gathering the photographs back into their envelope. The funeral is this Saturday at Clearwater Cemetery. It's going to be small. Just me, my family, and a few people who remember my parents from better times. If you and your wife would like to attend, you'd be welcome. I think my father would appreciate knowing that someone who understood his choice was there to see him properly laid to rest. After Emma left, Jake sat on his porch for a long time, watching the sun set over his own ranch. The cattle were settling for the evening, and Margaret was moving around inside the house, preparing dinner as she had for 32 years. It was a scene of such ordinary contentment that it almost hurt to contemplate how easily it could all disappear. That night, he held Margaret a little tighter as they fell asleep, understanding in a way he never had before that love wasn't just about the good times and the easy years. True love meant being willing to face impossible choices, to sacrifice everything for someone else's peace, to find courage in the darkest moments. The Mitchell family's story had ended in tragedy, but it had also revealed something profound about the lengths to which love could drive a human heart. Jake knew he would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his days, a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of love looked like something else entirely to the outside world. Saturday was just 3 days away, and Jake knew he would be there to see Thomas and Sarah Mitchell finally laid to rest together. Their long separation ended at last. Saturday morning dawned grey and overcast, with heavy clouds gathering over the Bitterroot Mountains like mourners assembling for a funeral. Jake stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting the black tie he hadn't worn since his own father's burial 5 years earlier. Margaret moved quietly around their room, her movements careful and reverent as she prepared for what they both knew would be an emotionally charged day. The drive to Clearwater Cemetery took 45 minutes through winding mountain roads that Jake had traveled countless times over the decades. But today, the familiar landscape seemed different, weighted with significance. Every ranch they passed reminded him of the Mitchell spread that had been sold decades ago. Every family home spoke of the continuity that Thomas and Sarah had been denied. Margaret reached across the truck's bench seat and took his hand as they turned into the cemetery gates. "Are you ready for this?" she asked softly. Jake squeezed her fingers. I don't think anyone can be ready for something like this. But Emma was right. Thomas would want someone there who understood what he did. The cemetery was older than the town itself, established by the first settlers who had pushed into the Montana Territory in the 1870s. Weathered headstones marked the graves of pioneers, ranchers, miners, and their families, creating a chronicle of hard lives lived against the backdrop of an unforgiving landscape. The newest section, where the Mitchell burial would take place, was located on a gentle hillside overlooking the valley where Thomas had once run cattle. A small group had already gathered around the gravesite when Jake and Margaret arrived. Emma stood beside a mahogany casket that contained both her parents. Her arm linked with that of a man Jake assumed was her husband. Two teenage children, Emma's grandchildren, flanked the couple, their young faces solemn, with an understanding that transcended their years. Sheriff Connolly was present in civilian clothes, her presence a testament to the respect the case had earned among law enforcement. Dr. Robert Henderson, the physician who had originally diagnosed Sarah's condition, stood apart from the group, his aged frame bent with the weight of difficult memories. A few other elderly residents of Clearwater had come to pay their respects, people who remembered the Mitchell family from happier times. The minister was Pastor William Hartley from the Clearwater Community Church, a man in his 70s who had known Thomas and Sarah personally. His weathered hands held a Bible that had clearly seen decades of use, and his eyes carried the compassion of someone who had presided over more than his share of tragic farewells. As Jake and Margaret approached the gathering, Emma broke away from her family and walked toward them. She was dressed in simple black, but she wore a piece of jewelry that caught Jake's attention, a silver locket that looked handmade, the kind of gift a loving husband might craft for his wife. Jake. Margaret, thank you for coming, Emma said, embracing them both. It means everything to me that you're here. Margaret took Emma's hands in hers. We wouldn't be anywhere else. Jake told me about your parents' story, and I want you to know that we understand the love that drove your father's decision. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she managed to smile. Would you like to meet my family? She asked, leading them toward the small group. Emma's husband, David Carson, was a gentle man in his early 60s with kind eyes and the calloused hands of someone who worked with tools for a living. Their son, Michael, a man in his 30s, bore a striking resemblance to the Thomas Mitchell that Jake had seen in the old photographs. The teenagers, Michael's children, were Emma's pride and joy, she explained, bright students who were both planning to attend college in the fall. Grandma Emma has told us all about Great-Grandpa Thomas and Great-Grandma Sarah, the girl said, her voice mature beyond her 16 years. We're honored to finally be able to say goodbye to them properly. As the small group settled around the gravesite, Pastor Hartley began the service with words that acknowledged the unique circumstances of the burial. We gather today not to mourn a recent loss, but to celebrate lives that ended 35 years ago, and to finally provide the proper farewell that was denied by circumstances beyond anyone's control. He began. Thomas and Sarah Mitchell were members of this community who faced challenges that would test any marriage, any family, any faith. The pastor's words were carefully chosen, acknowledging the tragedy without dwelling on the controversial nature of how the Mitchell story had ended. Jake found himself impressed by the man's sensitivity, his ability to honor both the love that had driven Thomas's decision and the grief that Emma had carried for decades. I knew Thomas and Sarah when they were young newlyweds, Pastor Hartley continued. I had the privilege of officiating at their wedding 23 years ago, in this very cemetery, actually, beneath the old oak tree where Sarah's grandparents were buried. They chose that spot because Sarah wanted to be married in a place where love had already been proven to last beyond death. Emma gasped softly at this revelation, clearly hearing this detail about her parents' wedding for the first time. Jake realized that even now, 35 years later, new pieces of the Mitchell story were still emerging. Thomas was a man of deep faith and deeper love, the pastor went on. When Sarah became ill, he struggled with questions that have plagued humanity since the beginning of time. How do we balance love with duty? How do we choose between hope and acceptance? How do we honor both the sanctity of life and the mercy of release from suffering? The minister paused, his eyes moving across the small gathering. I won't pretend to have easy answers to those questions, but I know that Thomas Mitchell made his choices from a place of love so profound that it transcended conventional wisdom and societal expectations. He chose to ensure that his beloved wife's suffering ended with dignity, and then he chose to join her rather than live with the weight of that decision alone. Jake noticed that several members of the group were crying openly now. Dr. Henderson's shoulders shook with emotion, and even Sheriff Connolly wiped tears from her eyes. This wasn't just a funeral service, but a recognition of the complexity of human love and the impossible choices that sometimes accompanied it. Emma Mitchell Carson has waited 35 years for this moment, Pastor Hartley said, turning toward Emma with obvious affection. She has carried the burden of not knowing what happened to her parents, and then the heavier burden of understanding exactly what occurred. Today, we release Thomas and Sarah from the isolation of their hidden resting place and welcome them into the community of souls who rest in this sacred ground. The pastor opened his Bible to a passage that Jake recognized as being from the book of Ruth. Entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. As the words were read, Emma stepped forward and placed a small bundle on top of the casket. Jake could see that it contained the toy horse, the painted tin cup, and several of the letters that had been part of the shrine in the cabin. She was reuniting her parents with the artifacts of their love, ensuring that they would be buried with the physical reminders of what had mattered most to them. These belong to my parents, Emma said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. They represent the love that sustained them through 20 years of marriage and the hope that gave them strength during the darkest period of their lives. I'm returning them now so that my parents can rest with the symbols of what made their lives meaningful. Dr. Henderson stepped forward next, his aged voice trembling with emotion. I've carried guilt about this case for 35 years, he admitted. I've wondered if I could have done more, if there were treatments I missed, if I failed Thomas and Sarah when they needed medical guidance most. But I've come to understand that some illnesses transcend medicine, and some love transcends conventional healing. Thomas and Sarah faced an enemy that had no cure, and they chose to face it together. There's a courage in that choice that I've come to respect, even as I've grieved the necessity of it. Sheriff Connolly spoke briefly about the investigation that had consumed decades of her department's attention. We never stopped looking for Thomas and Sarah, she said. Every lead was followed, every possibility explored. But sometimes the answers we seek are hidden not by deception, but by love, preserved not for discovery, but for protection. Emma's courage in finally sharing her family's story allows us to close this case with understanding rather than speculation. When it came time for Emma to speak, she stood quietly for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. Jake could see the little girl from the photographs in her face, the child who had hidden in her bedroom when her mother became frightening, who had been wise enough to understand that her father's final visit was a goodbye. I've spent my entire adult life trying to understand what happened to my parents, Emma began. I've been angry, confused, heartbroken, and sometimes even ashamed. I wondered if I could have done something different, if my father would have made a different choice, if I had been a better daughter, if I had somehow been enough to keep him anchored to life. She paused, her voice growing stronger. But age brings wisdom, and experience brings understanding. I've watched my own husband's father struggle with dementia. I've seen the way it steals not just memory, but personality, dignity, and identity. I felt the helplessness of watching someone you love disappear piece by piece while their body continues to function. And I've come to understand that my father's choice wasn't about abandoning me. It was about preserving the woman my mother had been. Emma's teenage granddaughter reached out and took her hand, a gesture of support that bridged 4 generations of women who had been shaped by this tragedy. My father preserved my mother's dignity by ensuring that her suffering ended before she lost everything, and that made her who she was, Emma continued. And he preserved their love by choosing to die as her husband rather than live as her widower. It was the most profound act of devotion I've ever encountered, and while I've grieved the loss of my parents my entire life, I've never doubted that their choice was rooted in love. The service concluded with the lowering of the casket, a moment that Jake found almost unbearably poignant. Thomas and Sarah Mitchell were finally being laid to rest together. Their 35-year separation ended at last. The headstone that Emma had commissioned was simple but elegant. Thomas and Sarah Mitchell, beloved husband and wife, united in love, reunited in peace, 1960-1987. As the small group began to disperse, Jake found himself standing alone beside the grave for a few minutes, offering his own silent tribute to a couple he had never met, but whose story had changed his understanding of love and sacrifice. Margaret joined him, slipping her arm through his as they contemplated the fresh earth that covered the Mitchell family's final resting place. "What are you thinking?" Margaret asked softly. Jake considered the question carefully. "I'm thinking about how many different ways there are to love someone. Thomas loved Sarah enough to let her go, when holding on would have meant watching her suffer. Emma loved her parents enough to search for the truth, even when it was painful. And we're standing here because sometimes love means honoring choices we don't fully understand." As they walked back toward their truck, Emma caught up with them one final time. She carried a small gift bag, which she presented to Jake with obvious emotion. "This is the last thing," she said. "I found it in my father's desk when we cleaned out the ranch house all those years ago. I never understood what it meant until now." Inside the bag was a leather journal, newer than the one Jake had found in the cabin, but clearly from the same era. The cover was embossed with the words, "For Emma," in gold lettering. "Open it," Emma urged. The journal contained dozens of letters, all addressed to Emma and written in Thomas's careful handwriting. They were dated throughout Emma's childhood and beyond, continuing even after the family's disappearance. The first was dated on Emma's 7th birthday. "My dearest Emma, by the time you read this, you'll be old enough to understand things that seem impossible now. I want you to know that every choice I made was based on love. Love for your mother, love for you, and love for the family we were before illness changed everything. I hope that someday you'll be able to forgive me for leaving you, and that you'll understand that some forms of love require sacrifices that look like betrayal to the outside world." Jake flipped through the journal, seeing entries for Emma's graduation, her wedding, the births of her children, and dozens of other milestones that Thomas would never witness. It was a father's attempt to continue parenting from beyond the grave, to offer guidance and love across the decades that separated them. "He wrote to me my entire life," Emma whispered. "Even after he was gone, he found a way to be my father." As Jake and Margaret drove home through the gathering dusk, they traveled in comfortable silence, both processing the emotional weight of the day. The Mitchell family's story had finally reached its conclusion, but the impact would ripple forward through time, touching the lives of everyone who had been privileged to witness love's ultimate expression. That night, as Jake held Margaret close in their own bed, he whispered a prayer of gratitude for the ordinary gift of growing old together, for the blessing of facing life's challenges side by side, rather than being forced to make impossible choices alone. The Mitchell family had taught him that love wasn't just about joy and companionship, but about courage and sacrifice, and the willingness to honor another person's dignity even at the cost of your own life. The mystery that had begun with a warning carved into a cabin wall, had become a meditation on the true meaning of devotion, and Jake knew he would carry that lesson with him for whatever years remained of his own love story with Margaret. 2 months after the funeral, Jake found himself standing once again in the aspen grove, where his discovery had begun, but this time he wasn't alone. Emma had returned to Montana with her son Michael and her grandson Tyler, a 17-year-old who bore an uncanny resemblance to Thomas Mitchell in the old photographs. They had come to dismantle what remained of the cabin and to close this chapter of their family's history permanently. The county had granted Emma permission to remove the structure, since it sat on land that technically belonged to the state, but had never been properly surveyed or claimed. Sheriff Connolly had facilitated the paperwork, understanding that Emma needed to control how this final piece of her parents' story was handled. Jake had volunteered to help with the demolition, bringing tools and his truck to haul away the materials. But as they stood before the cabin in the morning light, none of them seemed eager to begin the work of destruction. "It's smaller than I remembered," Emma said quietly, studying the structure that had haunted her imagination for months. "When I was here alone, it seemed so imposing, so full of secrets. Now it just looks like what it always was, a simple shelter built by people who needed a place to be together." Michael walked around the cabin's perimeter, examining the construction with the eye of someone who understood building techniques. "Grandfather did good work," he observed. "These joints are still solid after 40 years. He built this to last." Tyler, who had been unusually quiet during the drive from town, approached the cabin door with obvious hesitation. "Is it okay if I go inside?" he asked his grandmother. "I know what happened here, but I'd like to see where my great-grandparents spent their final days." Emma nodded, though Jake could see the effort it cost her. "Of course, sweetheart, just be respectful." The interior of the cabin looked different now that it was no longer a shrine. The authorities had removed the blanket and everything beneath it, and Emma had already collected the personal artifacts during her previous visit. What remained was just an empty room with scarred wooden floors and walls marked by decades of weather and neglect. Tyler stood in the center of the space, turning slowly to take in every detail. "It's peaceful," he said finally. "I thought it would feel sad or scary, but it doesn't. It feels like a place where people loved each other." His observation brought tears to Emma's eyes. "That's exactly what it was," she whispered. As they began the careful work of dismantling the cabin, each piece of wood seemed to tell part of the Mitchell family story. Jake and Michael worked on removing the roof beams, while Emma and Tyler sorted through smaller items that had been overlooked during the initial investigation. In a gap between the floorboards, Tyler discovered a small metal tin that had apparently fallen through the cracks decades earlier. Inside were several items that provided new insights into Sarah's personality: a pressed flower from her wedding bouquet, a ticket stub from a movie she and Thomas had seen on their first anniversary, and a small key attached to a paper tag marked Hope Chest. Mama had a hope chest, Emma remembered, examining the key with wonder. "It was in their bedroom when I was little, but it disappeared when she got sick. Daddy must have stored it somewhere, maybe in the barn at the old ranch." Michael looked up from his work on the roof. "The barn's still standing. The family that bought the ranch uses it for hay storage, but they might let us look around if we asked." The idea of finding Sarah's hope chest energized the group in a way that surprised Jake. Here was a tangible connection to the woman. Sarah had been before illness changed everything. A collection of items she had gathered while dreaming of her future with Thomas. They finished dismantling the cabin by late afternoon, stacking the usable lumber in Jake's truck while consigning the weathered pieces to a burn pile. Emma had decided to donate the good wood to a local church that was building a community center, ensuring that the materials from her parents' retreat would continue to serve people in need. As the sun began to set, they drove to the old Mitchell Ranch, now owned by the Hendersons, no relation to Dr. Henderson, but a young family who had moved from Oregon to try their hand at Montana ranching. Brad Henderson was a friendly man in his 30s who remembered hearing about the Mitchell disappearance when he was researching the property's history. "The barn's been solid as a rock," Brad told them as he led the way across the pasture. "Previous owners left some stuff in the loft, said it belonged to the original family. We never went through it, figured it wasn't our business. The barn was a classic Montana structure, built to withstand harsh winters and prairie winds." Climbing into the loft, they found it filled with the accumulated possessions of a working ranch family: old saddles, farm equipment, and several wooden crates marked with Sarah's maiden name. Emma's hands shook as she opened the first crate. Inside were dishes wrapped in newspaper, delicate china painted with tiny roses that Sarah had apparently been saving for special occasions. The newspaper was dated 1985, suggesting these items had been stored when Sarah's condition made entertaining impossible. The second crate contained linens, tablecloths embroidered with Sarah's initials, napkins edged with hand-tatted lace, and quilts in various stages of completion. Each piece showed the handiwork of a woman who took pride in creating beauty for her home and family. But it was the third crate that held the hope chest Emma remembered from childhood. Made of cedar and decorated with carved roses, it was exactly as Emma remembered, a treasure box that had seemed magical to her young eyes. Inside the hope chest were the dreams of a young woman preparing for marriage and motherhood, wedding announcements from friends, recipe cards copied in Sarah's careful handwriting, baby clothes in neutral yellows and greens, and a journal that documented her hopes for the future. Emma opened the journal with reverence, reading entries that revealed Sarah's personality before illness overshadowed everything else. March 15th, 1982. Tommy and I walked through the house plans again today. We've decided to add a reading nook in the master bedroom where I can sit and watch the sunrise while the baby naps. I want our children to grow up in a house full of books and music and laughter. July 4th, 1983. Emma took her first steps today. She toddled from the couch to Tommy's arms, giggling the whole way. I cried happy tears watching my two favorite people celebrate together. This is what joy looks like. November 12th, 1984. I've been feeling forgetful lately, losing track of conversations and misplacing things. Tommy says it's just new mother exhaustion, but something feels different. I'm going to start writing everything down just in case. I never want to forget these precious days with my family. The final entry was dated February 14th, 1985. Tommy gave me a locket for Valentine's Day, the one I've been wearing ever since. He said it's so I can always carry a picture of our family close to my heart. I put Emma's baby picture inside and a tiny photo of our wedding day. He said that no matter what happens, love is the thing that lasts forever. I pray he's right. Emma touched the locket at her throat, the same one Jake had noticed at the funeral. She had been wearing her mother's final gift, carrying those precious photos without knowing their significance. Tyler found another item in the hope chest that made everyone gasp. A letter addressed to my future self, dated 1980. Before Emma was born, dear Sarah, I'm writing this on the day Tommy proposed, and I'm so happy I can barely hold the pen steady. By the time you read this, we'll be married, maybe have children, maybe be grey and wrinkled and telling stories to our grandchildren about the day we fell in love. I hope you remember this feeling, the absolute certainty that nothing could ever come between us, that our love is strong enough to weather any storm. Promise me you'll remember how it felt to be this happy, this hopeful, this sure that forever wasn't long enough to love Thomas Mitchell. If you're reading this during a difficult time, remember that the woman who wrote these words chose you for Thomas because she knew you were strong enough to be his partner in anything life brought your way. Be brave, be kind, and never forget that you are deeply loved. Your younger self, Sarah. The letter's cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Sarah had written to herself with no knowledge of the trial that awaited her. the disease that would steal her memories and force her husband into an impossible position. Yet her words about being strong enough to be Thomas's partner had proven prophetic in ways she never could have imagined. As they carefully packed the hope chest contents back into the cedar container, Emma made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "I want to donate most of these things to the Historical Society," she announced. "Not the personal letters or the locket, but the quilts, the dishes, the everyday items that show how people lived and loved in this place and time. Sarah would want her handiwork to bring joy to other families." Michael studied his mother's face. "Are you sure? These are family heirlooms." Emma smiled, the first genuinely peaceful expression Jake had seen from her. "They were never meant to be kept in storage, hidden away like secrets. Sarah made these things to be used, to create beauty and comfort in daily life. Keeping them locked away would be another kind of burial." They loaded the hope chest and crates into Jake's truck as the last light faded from the Montana sky. The Henderson family invited them in for coffee, but Emma declined politely, saying she had one more stop to make before heading back to her hotel. She directed Jake to drive to the Clearwater Cemetery, where Thomas and Sarah's grave was marked by fresh flowers, roses that Emma had planted the day after the funeral. In the gathering darkness, the cemetery felt peaceful rather than mournful, a place where stories ended, but love endured. Emma knelt beside the headstone and placed her hand on the carved letters of her parents' names. "I found your hope chest, Mama," she whispered. "I found all the dreams you saved, all the love you put away for safekeeping. You were right about one thing. Love really is the thing that lasts forever." Tyler joined his grandmother beside the grave, his young voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I wish I could have known them," he said. "But hearing their story, it makes me understand something about what real love looks like. It's not just the happy parts. It's being willing to do whatever it takes to protect the person you love, even when it costs you everything." As they drove back to town, Emma shared more stories about her parents that she had never told anyone. Memories of Sarah singing while she cooked, of Thomas teaching Emma to ride a horse, of family picnics by the creek where they had all been happy together. These weren't the tragic figures from the cabin shrine, but a vibrant young family whose love had been tested by circumstances beyond their control. "I spent so many years focusing on how their story ended," Emma reflected, "but finding the hope chest reminded me of how it began, how much joy they shared before everything went wrong. That's what I want Tyler and his sister to remember, not the tragedy, but the love that was strong enough to last beyond death." Jake dropped Emma and her family at their hotel with plans to meet the next morning for breakfast before their flight back to Denver. As he and Margaret drove home through the familiar darkness of Montana backroads, they talked about the day's discoveries and what they revealed about the Mitchell family's complexity. "It changes everything, doesn't it?" Margaret observed, reading Sarah's hopes for the future, seeing all the ordinary happiness they shared before illness changed everything. "It makes Thomas's choice seem even more heartbreaking because we know what they lost," Jake nodded, thinking about the hope chest full of dreams that would never be fulfilled, the grandchildren Sarah would never meet, the growing old together that disease had stolen from them. But it also makes his choice seem more understandable. He wasn't just trying to end Sarah's suffering, he was trying to preserve the memory of who she had been when she was whole. That night, as Jake lay in bed beside his wife of 32 years, he thought about Sarah's letter to her future self and the naive confidence with which she had proclaimed that love could weather any storm. She had been wrong about her ability to survive what was coming, but she had been right about love's durability. Thomas's devotion had outlasted death, Emma's search for truth had spanned decades, and their story continued to touch lives they would never meet. The Mitchell family's tragedy had become a meditation on love's true nature. Not just the romantic feelings of courtship, but the deeper commitment that chose sacrifice over self-preservation, understanding over judgment, and mercy over law. It was a love story that had required lifting a blanket to understand, but once revealed, it shed light on what it truly meant to honor the sacred bond between two people who had promised to face whatever came together. In the morning, Jake would say goodbye to Emma and her family, but their story would remain with him, a reminder that some mysteries were worth solving, not for their shocking revelations, but for their profound truths about the human heart's capacity for both suffering and transcendence. 6 months after Emma's departure, Jake received an unexpected package at his ranch. The return address showed Emma Mitchell Carson in Denver, but the contents were far more intriguing than he had anticipated. Inside the carefully wrapped box was a manuscript, nearly 300 pages of typed text bound in leather, along with a handwritten note from Emma. "Dear Jake," the letter began, "I've spent the past 6 months writing down everything I could remember about my parents, everything I discovered about their story, and everything I learned from people like you who helped me understand their final choice. I think their story deserves to be told properly, not as a sensational mystery, but as a testament to love's true nature. Would you consider reading this and telling me if I've captured the truth as you experienced it?" The manuscript was titled "The Weight of Love, A Daughter's Journey to Understanding." Jake spent the next 3 days reading it cover to cover, often pausing to wipe tears from his eyes as Emma's eloquent prose brought the Mitchell family tragedy to life in ways that mere facts could never accomplish. Emma had interviewed dozens of people who had known her: parents, childhood friends, neighbors, Dr. Henderson, even the nurses who had cared for Sarah during her brief stay at the Denver facility. Each interview added layers to the portrait of a couple whose love had been tested by circumstances that would have destroyed weaker bonds. One section particularly moved Jake: Emma's interview with Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, who had been Sarah's closest friend and confidant during the early stages of her illness. Sarah knew what was happening to her mind. Mrs. Walsh had told Emma she wasn't in denial about the diagnosis or what it meant for her future. "I remember one afternoon when she called me over for tea. This was maybe 3 months before she and Thomas disappeared. She was having a good day, very lucid and present. She told me she had made Thomas promise that he wouldn't let the disease steal everything from her. She said she'd rather die as herself than live as a shadow of who she'd been. She made him swear that if the day came when she no longer recognized him or Emma, he would find a way to let her go with dignity. At the time, I thought she was just being dramatic, the way people sometimes are when they're first diagnosed with something scary. But looking back, I think Sarah was giving Thomas permission to make the choice he eventually made. She was asking him to love her enough to let her go before she became someone neither of them could recognize." This revelation transformed Jake's understanding of the story yet again. Thomas hadn't acted unilaterally in ending Sarah's life. He had honored a promise made to the woman he loved, a commitment to preserve her dignity even at the cost of his own peace of mind. Emma had also tracked down several of Thomas's childhood friends, men who were now in their 70s and 80s, but who remembered Thomas as a young man with unwavering principles and deep capacity for love. One of them, retired rancher Bill Murphy, had provided insight into Thomas's character that explained much about his final decision. "Tommy was the kind of man who kept his word no matter what it cost him," Murphy had told Emma. "When we were kids, maybe 12 or 13, his dog got hit by a car and was suffering something terrible. The vet was 3 hours away and the dog was in agony. Tommy's father told him sometimes the kindest thing you can do for something you love is to end its pain, even when it breaks your heart to do it. Tommy couldn't do it at first. He sat with that dog for hours, crying and trying to find another way. But eventually, he realized that keeping the dog alive was about his own needs, not the dog's welfare. He did what needed to be done, and then he cried for days afterward. That was Tommy. He would always choose what was right over what was easy, even when it destroyed him. The manuscript included copies of letters Emma had received from readers who had learned about her parents' story through newspaper accounts or word of mouth. Many were from people facing similar situations with their own loved ones, spouses, parents or children dealing with Alzheimer's, dementia or terminal illnesses that stripped away dignity and identity. One letter from a woman in California whose husband was in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's particularly stood out. Your father's story has given me permission to have conversations with my husband that I've been avoiding. We've talked about what he wants to happen when he no longer knows who I am, when he becomes frightened and confused all the time. He's asked me to promise that I won't let him linger in that twilight state, and your parents' story has shown me that sometimes love means being willing to make impossible choices. I don't know if I'll have your father's courage when the time comes, but knowing that someone else faced this decision and chose love over law gives me strength. As Jake read these letters, he realized that the Mitchell story had become larger than just one family's tragedy. It had become a touchstone for others facing similar impossible choices, a source of understanding for people who found themselves caught between legal obligations and moral imperatives. Emma had also included a section about the legal and ethical debates surrounding her father's actions. She had consulted with lawyers, bioethicists, and advocates for death with dignity legislation, exploring the complex questions raised by Thomas's choice. Dr. Patricia Brennan, a bioethicist at the University of Colorado, had provided Emma with context that helped explain why Thomas's decision, while illegal, wasn't necessarily immoral. The law is often a blunt instrument when applied to the nuanced realities of human suffering, Dr. Brennan had explained. Thomas Mitchell faced a situation where following the law would have meant prolonging his wife's psychological torment and his daughter's trauma. He chose what philosophers call moral agency, taking responsibility for the consequences of his actions based on love and mercy, rather than legal compliance. This doesn't mean we should encourage people to take the law into their own hands, but it does mean we need to have more nuanced conversations about end-of-life care, about the difference between prolonging life and prolonging suffering, and about the role of family members in making decisions about dignity and mercy. The manuscript concluded with Emma's reflections on how the discovery of her parents' story had changed her own approach to life and love. She wrote about learning to forgive Thomas for leaving her, about understanding that his choice had been motivated by love rather than abandonment, and about finding peace with a story that had no easy answers or comfortable conclusions. I spent 35 years angry at my father for disappearing from my life, Emma had written. I felt abandoned, cheated of the chance to say goodbye, robbed of the father-daughter relationship I had expected to continue into my adult years. But understanding the full context of his choice has taught me that sometimes love requires actions that look like betrayal. To those who don't understand the complete picture, my father didn't abandon me. He made an impossible choice between watching my mother disappear piece by piece and ensuring that her suffering ended with dignity. Then he chose to die beside her rather than live with the weight of that decision alone. It was an act of love so profound that it took me decades to comprehend its true nature. After finishing the manuscript, Jake called Emma to share his thoughts. She answered on the first ring, as if she had been waiting for his call. "It's beautiful, Emma," he said without preamble. "Heartbreaking and beautiful and true. You've managed to tell their story in a way that honors both the tragedy and the love that caused it." Emma's relief was audible in her voice. "I was afraid I might have been too close to the story to see it clearly. I wanted to make sure it captured what you saw when you found them, the sense that this was something sacred rather than just tragic." "You did that and more," Jake assured her. "This isn't just your parents' story anymore. It's a meditation on what love looks like when it's tested by impossible circumstances. Have you thought about trying to publish it?" Emma was quiet for a moment. "I've been contacted by a few publishers who heard about the story through newspaper accounts. but I'm not sure I want it to become a commercial enterprise. This feels too personal, too sacred for that. Jake understood her hesitation, but he also saw the value in sharing the Mitchell story with a wider audience. What if you could control how it's presented? Make sure it's treated with the dignity it deserves? I've actually been thinking about that, Emma admitted. There's a small press in Montana that specializes in regional stories, stories about the American West and the people who shaped it. They've approached me about doing a limited edition, with proceeds going to Alzheimer's research and support for families dealing with dementia. The idea appealed to Jake immediately. Turning the Mitchell tragedy into something that could help other families facing similar challenges seemed like a fitting tribute to Thomas and Sarah's memory. "What would you need from me?" Jake asked. "Would you consider writing a foreword? You were the one who found them, who first understood what their shrine meant. Your perspective would mean everything to readers who might otherwise judge my father's choice without understanding its context." Jake agreed without hesitation. Over the next several weeks, he worked on his contribution to Emma's manuscript, trying to capture the experience of discovering the cabin shrine and the gradual revelation of the truth behind the Mitchell family's disappearance. Writing about the experience forced Jake to examine his own reactions more deeply. He realized that finding the cabin had changed not just his understanding of the Mitchell story, but his appreciation for his own marriage to Margaret. The knowledge that love could be tested by circumstances beyond anyone's control had made him more grateful for the ordinary blessings of growing old together, of facing challenges as a team rather than being forced to make choices alone during this time. Jake also received a letter that surprised him, correspondence from Tyler, Emma's grandson, who was now a freshman at Montana State University studying agriculture with plans to return to ranching after graduation. "Mr. Morrison," Tyler wrote, "I wanted you to know that hearing my great-grandparents' story has influenced my choice of major and my plans for the future. I'm studying not just traditional ranching, but also therapeutic agriculture, programs that use farming and ranch work to help people dealing with memory loss and other cognitive challenges. My great-grandmother, Sarah, loved flowers and gardening, and I've learned that people with dementia often respond well to familiar activities like planting and tending plants. I want to create a ranch program that helps families like ours, where people can continue to experience joy and purpose even as other abilities fade. Your discovery of my great-grandparents led to understanding, and that understanding is leading to action. Their story isn't ending with tragedy. It's beginning something new that might help other families avoid the impossible choice my great-grandfather faced." Tyler's letter filled Jake with hope. The Mitchell story was generating ripple effects that extended far beyond the original tragedy, inspiring new approaches to care and compassion that might spare other families from facing Thomas's impossible decision. When Emma's book was finally published by Mountain Heritage Press, Jake attended the launch event at the Clearwater Community Library. The small gathering included many of the people who had been part of the Mitchell story: Sheriff Connolly, Dr. Henderson, Pastor Hartley, and several residents who remembered Thomas and Sarah from happier times. Emma read a passage from the book's conclusion, her voice steady and strong. Love is not just about joy and companionship, though it encompasses both. True love is about willingness to sacrifice, to make choices that serve the beloved's welfare, even when those choices come at tremendous personal cost. My father loved my mother enough to honor her request for dignity over duration, and he loved me enough to ensure that his choice wouldn't destroy my future. Their story asks difficult questions about mercy, about the difference between healing and prolonging suffering, about the role of law versus love in our most intimate decisions. I don't have easy answers to these questions, and I suspect anyone who claims to have simple solutions hasn't fully grasped the complexity of the choices involved. What I do know is that love sometimes requires us to act beyond the boundaries of conventional wisdom, to choose mercy over safety, understanding over judgment. My parents' story is not a prescription for how others should handle similar situations, but it is a testament to love's capacity to transcend even death itself. As the evening concluded and people began to leave, Jake found himself standing once again with Emma beside the display table where copies of her book were arranged next to the family, photographs that had started his understanding of the Mitchell story. "What's next for you?" Jake asked. Emma smiled, and Jake could see peace in her expression that had been absent during their first meeting. "I'm going to live, Jake. For 35 years, I've been defined by the mystery of my parents' disappearance. Now that I understand their choice and have shared their story, I can finally move forward. I want to spend time with my grandchildren, help Tyler develop his therapeutic agriculture program, and maybe even write another book, this time about healing rather than tragedy." As Jake drove home through the familiar Montana darkness, he reflected on the journey that had begun with a search for lost cattle and had evolved into a profound meditation on love's true nature. The Mitchell family's story had taught him that some mysteries were worth solving, not for their shocking revelations, but for their deeper truths about human resilience, sacrifice, and the enduring power of love to transcend even the most impossible circumstances. The blanket had been lifted, the truth revealed, and rather than bringing only sorrow, that truth had become a source of understanding, healing, and hope for future generations who might face similar challenges with greater wisdom and compassion. 5 years later, Jake Morrison stood at the edge of what had once been the aspen grove where his life-changing discovery began. The trees remained, their white bark now scarred with initials carved by young lovers who had somehow learned that this place held significance for those who understood the true meaning of devotion. A small memorial plaque, installed by the county at Emma's request, marked the spot where the cabin had stood. The inscription was simple, in memory of Thomas and Sarah Mitchell, who taught us that love sometimes requires the courage to make impossible choices. Their story reminds us that the deepest devotion lies not in holding on, but in knowing when to let go. Jake was not alone on this anniversary morning. Margaret stood beside him, her hair now silver, but her eyes still bright with the same intelligence that had drawn him to her 40 years ago. They had driven here together as they did every year on this date, a private pilgrimage that had become their way of honoring what the Mitchell story had taught them about the precious fragility of their own love. In the distance, another figure approached through the morning mist. Tyler Carson, now 22 and recently graduated from Montana State, walked toward them with the confident stride of a young man who had found his purpose. Behind him came an older woman Jake didn't immediately recognize, elegant, perhaps in her 70s, with silver hair and eyes that seemed familiar. "Mr. Morrison." "Mrs. Morrison," Tyler called out as he drew near. "I hope you don't mind us joining you. I brought someone who wanted to see this place." The woman stepped forward with a grace that spoke of lifelong dignity. "I'm Helen Mitchell Davis," she said, extending her hand. "Thomas was my brother. I'm Emma's Aunt Helen." Jake's heart skipped. This was the woman who had raised Emma after her parents' disappearance, who had carried the weight of not knowing what had happened to her brother and sister-in-law for 35 years. "I never came here before," Helen admitted, her voice steady despite the emotion Jake could see in her eyes. "Even after Emma found them, after we learned the truth, I couldn't bring myself to visit the place where Tommy made his final choice. But I'm 81 now, and I realized I needed to see it for myself before it's too late." Helen gazed at the memorial plaque, reading the inscription slowly. "Emma wrote those words," she said. "She asked me to approve them before they were engraved. I wasn't sure about that last line, knowing when to let go, because part of me still wishes Tommy had chosen differently, had found another way." Tyler placed a gentle hand on his great-aunt's shoulder. "But you understand why he couldn't, don't you?" Helen nodded slowly. "I do now. After watching my own husband struggle with dementia for the last 3 years, After seeing what that disease does to a person's dignity and identity, I understand what Tommy was trying to protect Sarah from. I understand why he couldn't bear to watch her disappear completely. She reached into her purse and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in tissue paper. I brought something that belonged to them, something I've been saving for 60 years, waiting for the right moment to let it go. Inside the tissue was a simple silver ring, a man's wedding band, well worn and inscribed with tiny letters that were barely visible after decades of wear. This was Tommy's wedding ring, Helen explained. He gave it to me the night before he and Sarah went to the cabin for the last time. He said he wanted someone in the family to have it, someone who would remember that he'd worn it with pride and honor for 23 years. Helen held the ring up to the morning light, and Jake could just make out the inscription, T&S Forever. He asked me to give it to Emma someday, when she was old enough to understand what it meant. But Emma has her mother's locket, and she said this ring should go to Tyler, to carry forward into the next generation. Tyler accepted the ring with reverence, sliding it onto his right hand where it fit perfectly. I'll wear it with honor, Aunt Helen, and someday, when I have a son of my own, I'll tell him the story of his great-great-grandfather who loved so deeply that he was willing to sacrifice everything for the woman he cherished. As they stood together in the grove, Jake reflected on how the Mitchell story had continued to evolve and inspire even after what seemed like its conclusion. Tyler's therapeutic ranch program had become reality, with funding from the proceeds of Emma's book and donations from families who had been touched by the story. Located just 20 miles from where they now stood, Sarah's garden provided a place where families dealing with Alzheimer's and dementia could find support, understanding, and practical help. The program included not just therapeutic activities, but counseling for family members facing impossible decisions, legal guidance for end-of-life planning, and support groups for those who had chosen mercy over convention. Tyler had created what he called a bridge between love and law, helping families navigate the treacherous waters that had claimed his great-grandparents. "Have you heard from Emma recently?" Jake asked Tyler. Tyler smiled. "She's doing well. Grandmother Emma is actually writing another book, this one about healing from family trauma and finding peace with difficult truths. She says the Mitchell story taught her that some wounds can become sources of wisdom if we're willing to do the hard work of understanding rather than just grieving." Helen looked surprised. "I didn't know Emma was writing again." "She wanted to surprise you," Tyler said. "The new book includes a whole section about you, about how you raised her with love and stability, even though you were dealing with your own grief and confusion about what had happened to Tommy and Sarah. She says you taught her that families can be rebuilt after tragedy, that love doesn't end with death or disappearance." Tears gathered in Helen's eyes. "I tried so hard to give Emma a normal childhood, but I always worried that the uncertainty about her parents would damage her somehow." "It did change her," Tyler acknowledged, "but not in the way you feared. It made her stronger, more compassionate, more determined to understand rather than judge. Without that experience, she never would have become the woman who could write their story with such wisdom and grace." As the morning progressed, the small group shared stories about how the Mitchell legacy continued to influence their lives. Margaret talked about how the story had changed her approach to her work as a volunteer at the local hospice, helping families navigate end-of-life decisions with greater understanding and less judgment. Jake spoke about the conversations he and Margaret had begun having about their own wishes for the future. Difficult discussions that the Mitchell story had taught them were necessary rather than morbid. They had created detailed advance directives, not just about medical care but about dignity, about what they would want if faced with similar circumstances to those that had confronted Thomas and Sarah. "The Mitchell story taught us that love isn't just about the good times," Jake said. "It's about being willing to have hard conversations, to make difficult plans, to prepare for the possibility that we might someday face choices we hope we'll never have to make." As the sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows through the aspen trees, Helen made a request that surprised everyone. "Would you mind if I spent a few minutes alone here?" she asked. "I need to say goodbye to my brother properly. I need to tell him that I understand, that I forgive him, and that I'm proud of the legacy he and Sarah left behind." The others retreated to give Helen privacy, walking back toward the memorial plaque while she stood where the cabin had once housed her brother's final act of love. When she rejoined them 10 minutes later, her face was peaceful in a way that suggested a burden had finally been lifted. "What did you tell him?" Tyler asked gently. Helen smiled through her tears. "I told him that his great-nephew is carrying on the family tradition of choosing love over convenience, of putting other people's welfare before your own comfort. I told him that Sarah's name lives on in the garden that helps other families, and that their story has become a source of healing rather than just tragedy." As they prepared to leave the grove, Jake realized that this final gathering had brought the Mitchell story full circle. What had begun with his discovery of a warning carved into a cabin wall had evolved into a legacy of understanding, compassion, and practical help for others facing similar trials. The blanket had been lifted, not just to reveal a tragic secret, but to uncover truths about love's true nature that continued to guide and inspire years after the original discovery. Thomas and Sarah Mitchell's impossible choice had become a testament to the lengths that devotion could drive a human heart, and their daughter's courage in sharing that story had transformed private tragedy into public wisdom. Walking back to their vehicles, Jake took one last look at the memorial plaque. The inscription that had once seemed like an ending now felt like a beginning, an invitation for others to consider what love really meant when tested by impossible circumstances. As they drove away from the grove, Jake knew he would return again next year, and the year after that, for as long as he was able. The Mitchell story had become part of him, a reminder that some mysteries were worth solving not for their shocking revelations, but for their profound truths about the human capacity for both suffering and transcendence. The cowboy who had come, searching for lost cattle, had found something far more valuable, an understanding of love that was deep enough to encompass both joy and sorrow, holding on and letting go, life and the mercy that sometimes lay beyond it. And in finding that understanding, Jake Morrison had discovered that the most important blankets we lift are not those covering physical mysteries, but those concealing the sacred truths about how far love will go when everything else falls away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.